Hi guys, Craig here and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today's video is going to be all about Amelia Dyer. Amelia Dyer is believed to have murdered hundreds of babies in the 19th century, and her crimes led to one of the most sensational trials of the period. And it shone a spotlight on the Victorian practice of baby farming. So how did a seemingly respectable woman stoop to such cruelty? Let's find out. Let me tell you about what little information we do have about Amelia's early life. Amelia was born the youngest out of 5 children in a small village in Bristol, England. She was the daughter of a master shoemaker called Samuel and his wife Sarah. Unlike a lot of people at the time, Amelia wasn't born into poverty. She was actually quite well off. At an early age, she learned to read and write, and all throughout her life, she had a love of literature and poetry. Although Amelia didn't have it easy in her childhood. She had it tough due to her mother's mental illness. Her mother suffered from typhus. Typhus, or also known as typhus fever, was a group of infectious diseases. Common symptoms would be headaches, fever, and rashes. These symptoms would normally show themselves 1 to 2 weeks after exposure. The disease was caused by a bacterial infection in the body. Amelia witnessed her mother's violent rages, and she was often subjected to beatings due to the illness. But as was custom of the time, Amelia had to care for her mother until her death. Researchers would later go on to say that due to this, Amelia's mental health must have been affected. Amelia also had 2 sisters, both called Sarah Ann. One would die in 1841 and the other would die in 1845. At the age of 24, Amelia became permanently estranged from her family. At this point, she moved into some lodgings of her own, and it would be here that Amelia would meet and marry her first husband, George Thomas. The pair would lie on their marriage certificate. Amelia would state that she was 30 years old, when in fact she was only 24. And George, who was actually 59, would claim to be 48. The pair would do this so that they would lessen the age gap between them. So after marrying George, Amelia trained as a nurse. This was a very tough job in Victorian England. There was a lot of disease and a lot of death, but it was classed as a very respectable job for a woman of the time. Through being a nurse, Amelia would meet a lady called Ellen Danes, and Ellen Danes would introduce Amelia to what she called an easy way of making a living. And this easy way of making a living would be by using her own home to provide lodgings for women that had conceived children illegitimately. So conceiving a child illegitimately basically means having a child out of wedlock. Once she had provided the lodging for these women, she would then farm out their babies for adoption. Mothers in Victorian England really struggled to get an income. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act had removed any financial obligation that fathers had to illegitimate children, and this inevitably left mothers in dire straits. So any single woman bringing up an illegitimate child in Victorian England would be highly stigmatised. So this led to the practice known as baby farming. Baby farming is the historical act of taking in an infant or a child in exchange for a one-off payment or weekly fees. The predicament of the parents involved was often exploited for money. So if a baby had well-off parents, they could be charged anything up to £80, which is about £6,000 in today's money. A lesser fee might be negotiated if the father of the illegitimate child just wants to hush up his involvement. But in Victorian England, it was more common for these women to be extremely impoverished. So a charge of about £5, which is £500 in today's money, would normally be negotiated. Some of these horrible people would even resort to starving the farmed out babies. Noisy or needy babies may be given an alcohol opiate substance to semi-sedate them or to keep them quiet. Many of the children died to such dubious practices. So not long after meeting Amelia, Ellen Danes had to flee back to the US to avoid authorities. Round about this time as well, Amelia had to leave her job as a nurse due to falling pregnant with her own daughter. And sadly for Amelia, also at this time, her ageing husband George also died. So at this point, Amelia was keen to start bringing in some money. And it was now that she decided to become a baby farmer. And alongside taking in expectant women, she advertised to adopt and nurse their babies in return for a substantial one-off payment or weekly fee, as well as adequate clothing for that child. In her advertisements and meetings with potential clients, she would always convince them she was a respectable married woman and that she would care for their child like it was her own. In 1872, Amelia married William Dyer. He was a labourer from Bristol. They had 2 children together, Mary Ann, also known as Polly, and William. Amelia would eventually go on to leave her husband, but although searching, I can't find any facts as to why she done this. At some point in her baby farming career, Amelia decided to forego the inconvenience of starving and neglecting the babies. So soon after receiving each child and getting them into her custody, she would murder them, allowing her to pocket most of the fee. For a long time, Amelia eluded the resulting interests from police, but she was eventually caught in 1879 after a doctor was suspicious for the amount of times he was called out to certify the death of a child that had been in Amelia Dyer's care. However, instead of being convicted for murder or manslaughter, the courts decided that it was neglect that Amelia was guilty of and sentenced her to 6 months hard labour. It is alleged that the experience of the 6 months hard labour nearly destroyed Amelia mentally. But people of the day were absolutely disgusted about the leniency of the sentence passed. Upon her release, she attempted to revive her nursing career, but this was ultimately unsuccessful. Amelia also had time in a lot of mental institutions due to her alleged instability and suicidal tendencies. But funnily enough, these always coincided with when Amelia had to disappear. Amelia also started to abuse opium-based products early in her killing career. Her mental instability could have been linked to this. So in 1890, Amelia Dyer returned to baby farming, and it was around this time that she took in a child for a local governess. When the governess returned to check on her child, she was immediately very suspicious. She stripped her baby down to see if the birthmark was still on her leg, which it wasn't. But even though the governess was extremely suspicious of Amelia, there was not much she could do. She couldn't go to the police because of the stigma attached to having a child illegitimately. But it was at this time police did start to take an interest in Amelia Dyer's activity again. But of course, she pretended to have yet another mental breakdown to avoid police. It was at this point that Amelia Dyer tried to take her own life by overdosing on opiate products. But due to her long-time substance abuse, she had built up a slight intolerance to opium and survived the suicide attempt. So inevitably, once again, Amelia Dyer returned to baby farming and murder. But Amelia soon realised that she could no longer rely on doctors to certify the baby's deaths, so she started disposing of the bodies herself. The precarious nature and extent of her activities once again got Amelia some undesired attention. She was once again alerted to the police, and once again, to avoid them, she decided to move on. It was at this point that Amelia would move from town to town with different aliases to avoid police suspicion. So in 1883, Amelia was released from her final stint in a mental institution. Due to Amelia being a nurse, she would know what it would take to have an easy run in these institutions. But her last run was most disagreeable, and this is the last time she would ever enter a mental asylum. Amelia also had a brief stint in a workhouse, and it was here that she would meet Jane Smith, and the pair would move to Kensington Road in Reading. Jane was convinced by Amelia that whenever they were around a potential client, that she would refer to Amelia as Mother. This was to create a family-friendly environment. In January 1896, a woman called Evelina gave birth to an illegitimate daughter. She would go on to call the daughter Doris. She gave birth to her in a boarding house, and she quickly sought offers of adoption. And she placed an advert in the miscellaneous section of the Bristol Times newspaper. And it simply read, "Wanted, a respectable woman to care for my child." Evelyn hoped to return to work and then eventually come back to claim her child when she had her life more together. Coincidentally, next to her own advertisement was an advertisement that read, "Married couple looking to adopt a healthy baby. We have a nice country home and our terms is a one-off payment of £10. Eveline responded to the advert, and a few days later she got a response from a Mrs. Harding. And Mrs. Harding wrote that she would be glad to adopt the little girl, as she always wanted a little girl of her own, and that she was in fairly good circumstances and her and her husband were well off, but they just couldn't have kids of their own. Eveline then met Mrs. Harding, who of course was actually Amelia Dyer. Eveline wanted to pay a more affordable weekly payment for her daughter, but Amelia demanded a more substantial one-off payment. Eveline was distraught at giving up her daughter, even accompanying them right the way to the train station. She then reluctantly handed over her child with a box of clothes and the £10 one-off payment. Eveline did note that she was a little bit surprised about Amelia's age and her stumpy appearance, but she did note that Amelia seemed to be very affectionate towards her daughter. Amelia told Eveline that they would be travelling back to Reading and that she would write to her within a few days. So after a few days passed, Amelia did write to Eveline, stating that everything was okay with the child. Eveline wrote back, but that was the last time she ever heard from Amelia Dyer. Amelia didn't travel to Reading. She actually travelled to her daughter Polly's house in London. Once she arrived in London, she quickly found some white edging tape made in dressmaking. She would then wrap this tape around baby Doris's neck and tie a knot. Death would not have occurred immediately, but eventually she would have strangled her to death. Amelia would later go on to say that she used to enjoy watching them struggle with the tape around their neck. It is then alleged that both Amelia and her daughter Polly wrapped baby Doris in a napkin. The following day, on Wednesday the 1st of April 1896, another child named Harry Simmons was taken into Amelia's care. But at this point, Amelia didn't have any white edging tape left, so she removed the white edging tape from the corpse of baby Doris and wrapped it around Harry's neck, thus also strangling him to death. On April the 2nd, both bodies were placed into a carpet bag and weighted down with bricks. Amelia then went to a secluded spot on the River Thames and threw them both in. Amelia wouldn't be able to continue this for much longer, because on the 30th of March 1896, a package was found floating on the Thames, and it contained the body of baby Helena Fry. The package wasn't weighted down properly, which quickly made it come to the surface. But luckily, the very small police force at the time managed to get a breakthrough. As well as finding a label from Temple Meads Station in Bristol, they also used microscopic analysis on the wrapping paper, and they could faintly make out a name. That name was of a Mrs. Thomas, another alias of Amelia Dyer at the time. It also had an address on it, which police quickly got a warrant for. At this point, police decided to put Amelia Dyer under surveillance, and they used a young woman as a decoy, pretending to have a meeting with Amelia about potentially adopting her daughter. So after an initial visit, a second visit was set up, and it was on this second visit when Amelia Dyer opened the door, police were standing there, who promptly arrested her on the suspicion of murder. On April 3rd, which was actually Good Friday, the police searched the home of Amelia Dyer. They were absolutely disgusted by the stench of human decomposition, although no human remains were actually found. There was, however, plenty of other evidence found in Amelia Dyer's house, such as edging tape used to strangle the babies, telegraphs about potential adoptions, letters from parents inquiring about their babies, and also a lot of children's clothes. It is estimated that Amelia Dyer, over a course of decades, maybe murdered up to 400 children, making her one of the world's worst serial killers. So on the 4th of April, Amelia Dyer was charged with murder, and her son-in-law Arthur was also charged with accessory to murder. During April, the River Thames was searched, and 6 more bodies were recovered, including baby Doris and baby Harry, Amelia Dyer's last 2 victims. Each baby had been strangled with tape, and chillingly, Amelia Dyer would later go on to say, "Yes, that's how you knew they were one of mine." At the inquests into the deaths, there was no actual evidence that Amelia's daughter Polly and her son-in-law Arthur actually did act as Amelia's accomplices. Arthur was then discharged after a written confession by Amelia. On the 22nd of May 1896, Amelia Dyer appeared at the Old Bailey and pleaded guilty to the murder of baby Doris. Her family and associates testified against her at the trial, saying that they had been growing ever suspicious of her strange behaviour. Amelia's daughter would also go on to give damning evidence against her mother. But one of the most crucial witnesses at the trial was a man that actually seen and spoke to Amelia while she was disposing of the bodies of baby Doris and baby Harry. The only defence that Amelia had at the time was pleading insanity due to her stints in the mental institution. But the prosecution argued and won by saying that Amelia only went in to these mental institutions to avoid police and to avoid getting caught. It took the jury to deliberate only 4.5 minutes, and they came back stating that they found Amelia Dyer guilty of murder. In her 3 weeks in a confined cell, Amelia Dyer wrote 5 exercise books worth of what she called her last confession. When the chaplain visited her the night before her execution, he says to her, "Do you have anything to confess?" She then handed him these books and says there's nothing more to say. Amelia Dyer was then hanged by James Billingham at Newgate Prison on Wednesday the 10th of June 1896. Asked on the scaffold if she had anything to say, she simply stated, "I have nothing left to say." So guys, that was the story of Amelia Dyer. I really hope that you liked this video. So if you did, please think about giving it a big thumbs up, subscribing to the channel and sharing this video. So I will see you all next time. Bye!